Hello Internet! Guess what? I had ankle surgery! If you saw my last video, you may remember that I was trying to do the project in 25 hours, yes, but also in 3 days. And the reason is because I was 5 days away from surgery. Of course, I'm recovering from surgery, so it's been kind of hard to get any filming done. Because of that, I thought it might be a good time to talk about this. This is my take on La Llorona. I hope I'm pronouncing that right. Like I'm not obviously not a Spanish speaker. Anyway, I know it's wrong, but I'm trying. Okay. This is my take on La Llorona, the Central American, Latin American legend about. Okay, this is gonna be dark. A woman who, through a series of very unfortunate circumstances, drowns her kids and then drowns herself and becomes a ghost looking for other kids to drown, mistaking them for her own. Yeah, it's dark. You can blame the channel Extra Credits for this one. It was their video that I saw that inspired me to do a take on the character slash legend slash myth, whatever you want to call it. Now, this was meant to be my second video for the channel. I had sculpted this after I'd completed Fairy Princess vs. Demon Raider. You can see them right up there. But to be really candid about it, I had a really hard time with this piece emotionally, due in no small part to the subject matter, and you know, I decided that I wasn't ready to put out the video or whatever at the time. Having gotten some distance from the project, I figured now might be a good time to actually talk about it. So what I'll do here is I'll run the footage that I got from making this thing and narrate it. The original footage of me talking to the camera was all junk. So let's take a look at some footage and we'll talk through this together, you and I. Okay, so as usual, I start with the basic anatomical form. I put in a bit more effort on the skeleton stage on this one. Normally I just set a rough rib cage and hips and proceed right to the muscles, but because this character is going to be really bony and withered, I thought it was important to be a bit more accurate with the skeleton than usual. And there's the skeleton. You can see here I'm already looking for dress designs. I ended up going with my own design inspired by traditional slash historical images, but I did want it to base it off of something real and something that could exist as opposed to something completely imaginary. Now I'm starting to fill out the skeleton. I'm putting in some basic texturing here to help sell the look. Some nice sharp lines really sells the rougher, more withered appearance that I want her to have. Now that the form is complete, we can start posing. I wanted her to be coming out of the river, maybe stepping up onto the riverbank, being that La Llorona is known to haunt the riverways looking for her child. For now, I was happy with this action slash pose, so I moved on to a mock-up paper towel dress. You've seen me do this before. It's a really good way to test the silhouette of a dress or a cape really quickly. And I'm wetting down the paper towels because it adds weight, and conveniently, she's supposed to be soaking wet anyway. For her hair, I wanted it to be kind of sparse and clumpy looking, kind of like a zombie. Okay, stop. See this right here? This is the skeleton of a child. What I was trying to do was add some visual interest behind her so there's something to look at from every angle. I happen to have had a spare armature from another project, so I thought, oh, why not? It's quite the right size, so maybe we'll just put something here. I was coming at it purely from a compositional standpoint, but this will turn out to be a very bad idea. And I need to point it out now because if you are sensitive to the subject of kids in danger or children dying, this video might not be for you. It doesn't get super graphic or anything, but honestly it's the main reason why I had such a hard time with it personally. I'll get into all that later, but for now I think it's worth giving you a fair warning. Anyway, moving on. I'm at this point largely happy with the composition, such as it is, so I'm moving on to the anatomy. So I'm fixing all the breaks and the structural issues that occurred from posing the character. I didn't end up going too detailed with the anatomy, especially in the legs, because it's all gonna get covered up by the skirt anyway. Most important is to get the pointy parts like the knees and the hip bones and whatnot looking pretty decent, because that's the stuff that you're gonna see underneath the wet skirt. Now that the anatomy is in decent shape, I'm moving on to the skirt, which is going to be the main hard part of this piece, at least technically speaking. These clay noodles are there to set the hem length of her skirt, because I was really concerned about how her front knee is going to affect that. But in retrospect, I don't think this is a very good method for making dresses, mainly because it has no structure and it gets really hard to work with after a while, so lesson learned there. And she's supposed to be soaking wet, just stepped out of the river kind of wet, so I'm keeping the clothing really skin tight where appropriate. These little ruffles on her waistline is just a sketch for now. I'm doing them very quickly to see how the lines affect the figure and how their thickness affect the silhouette. I pay a lot of attention to silhouettes when I sculpt. And now you can see me filling out the dress with some blocks of clay to make them solid enough to work with. As I was saying, these clay noodles were not a great idea and I would not do it this way again. Now, I was not using a reference at this point. I was just kind of making things up as I go. This, again, is a pretty bad idea. I really didn't know how cloth worked at the time, and to try to do it without a reference is pretty silly. And here's me trying to use a reference. Finally! I just had a couple of big pieces of muslin laying around that I used for lighting diffusion, but actually they turned out to be very useful for stuff like this. Sorry this is out of focus, by the way. There's a lot of that this time around because shooting from my right side actually makes it really hard to keep things in frame and in focus. I will not be doing that again either. And even though I was looking at my reference just now, this double drape thing on her front thigh is actually wrong, but for now I decided it's more important to work on her head and face. I'm trying two different versions of the head, one that's really decayed and one that's a little bit more fleshy and human. This first version is the more decayed one. Basically, I'm sculpting a skull first, then laying strips of flesh on top. This way the skull is nice and correct and I can really control how decayed she is. It's a lot easier and more fun than the final result makes it seem, actually. And here comes the second version. This one I wanted to be more human-like. Really, the only thing that's unusual I went with was empty sockets for eyes. I really felt like it was important that this character doesn't have eyes, whichever version I ended up with. There's the two versions side by side. At this point, I still hadn't decided on which version to go with, so I went back to work on the dress instead to give myself some time to think, because as I said before, the double drape thing on the dress was wrong and I knew it. What I ended up doing was to simplify it and make just one giant flow from back to front rather than having a pinch in the middle. I was messing with the reference piece of cloth a bit too much and not letting the folds and drapes happen where they were naturally going to happen. Using your reference correctly is also a thing, as it turns out. And this might be a bit too much information, but to really figure out how the dress worked, I eventually decided to go stand in the shower while I had the cloth on to see how it worked when wet, and it ended up being pretty informative. It's not perfect by any means, but I am pretty happy with how it turned out. Okay, back to the head selection. I still couldn't decide which one I wanted at this point, so I decided to put them on the body to see how it looked in a kind of a larger context. Of course, this is the more human version. Here I'm taking a video of the options so I can compare them. And here's the decayed version, so yeah, putting them on the body definitely helped. Specifically, it told me that the piece really needed a strong point of interest to draw our eyes, and the decayed version just did a much better job of that, so that's what I decided to go with. Except it's too big! So I have to sculpt a smaller version of the decayed head so that it would be actually proportional to the body. Ultimately, I ended up sculpting 3 heads for this piece, 2 prototypes and 1 final. Not that much more to talk about for the head. It's the same process again, skull first, flesh on top, you know? So I'm just gonna let this run for a bit so you can see what all I did. The nice thing about a simpler piece like this is that there's a bit more time in the video to show the actual process as opposed to the big, complicated, epic sculpts where I'm just struggling to fit in all the creative decision making and not much time for the actual sculpting process. So that's the head. Hair is still temporary because it's quite delicate and I like to keep hair for later on in the process. We're getting pretty close overall now. I'm starting to refine the cloth folds, reducing their sizes, smoothing out the shapes somewhat. Not that much smoothing though, because this piece actually benefits a lot from having a rougher finish. Here I'm replacing the temporary waist scrunchies. This is another one of those easier than it looks type things. I just came up with a process that works and repeated it again and again until her waist is completely covered in the scrunchies. The individual lumps of cloth doesn't look amazing, but overall I think it's a pretty convincing effect. Of course, knowing how the clay is going to react to smoothing solvents help out a lot too. Because I know it's going to smoosh down and clean up to some degree, I didn't have to worry too much about getting it super clean at the start. Hands time. Honestly, these don't look great. Not my best work. It's not completely awful, but this is definitely one of those things I wish I'd done a better job on looking back on it now. So, enjoy crappy hands! Okay, this is where I'm gonna finally work on the child. Again, if you're sensitive to this kind of stuff, please skip ahead or just close the video now. Alright, so the first thing I tried was to make the child a skeleton, because I thought that if it was a flesh and blood child, it would just be too morbid. But the problem is that I didn't like the skeleton because it created a time delay for La Llorona herself. I didn't think it worked for her to be howling over a long, decayed skeleton. So I went against my earlier judgment and decided to make a freshly dead child because I thought it made a more immediate moment with La Llorona and would make the piece more scary and interesting. This would turn out to be a really big mistake, which I'll elaborate more on in just a second, but this right here, when I put the boy down on the ground, this is where I stopped. You know, even now, I still have a hard time looking at this. And maybe you're wondering, what's the big deal? It's just a little form of a child. There's no detail, nothing is defined. But here's the thing. That's not what I see. I don't see just a little clay form. I see a completed, living, breathing person. And in this case, the person's not alive anymore. That image that I saw and still see in my mind, it just shakes me right to my core. When I saw this in person, when I put that thing together in person, it scared me in terms of what it meant for me as a person and as an artist. And you know, I still don't know what it means to me to this day and why this project, why this imagery affected me so deeply and badly. The way I work, you know, when I sculpt, it's not just a technical exercise for me. With every video and with every character you've seen me do, I really try every time, including this one, to get into the character's head and to embody what they were feeling at the time, because that's what I want to capture. It's not just about making cool characters, it's about making something that feels alive. And I think when I did that for this one, I tried to touch, to even imagine what it must have felt like for this character to be stuck as a ghost after having killed her own kids, and what it must have felt like in this moment right after another one, yet another one, just to even try to imagine it. I was just completely unprepared for what that, even just a little bit of that felt like, and it just knocked me right over. Maybe I'll think about it in a different way in about a year and a half or whatever. And maybe this is a worse piece of art for me having backed off from this. Maybe this was the way to get the maximum connection with what La Llorona must have been feeling. But I just wasn't ready for it. I'm still not ready for it. So, I don't know. That's all I have to say about this for now. We can just go through the rest of the footage real quick. There's not much more to do. It's just really a bunch of refinements to just take it to the finish line. So obviously I decided to remove the boy, and the rest of the stuff is not super complicated. I just moved the piece to a smaller base and started to do final detailing and clean up on the whole figure. Here I'm adjusting her face one last time and replacing her temporary hair with the final version. The lines on her hair strips are made intentionally wobbly to simulate wetness and sparseness. I tried to leave little windows to her scalp to represent decay because I didn't want her to have a full head of hair, as I said before. Here I'm cleaning up the torn edges of the dress, or I guess roughing them up actually. I like this tear a lot. I think it adds a lot to the backside of the composition. And now for feet, or foot rather, there's only one to do, and like the rest of the figure, it doesn't need to be super clean. In fact, it benefits from being kind of roughed up. And here are scrunchies for her top. They're done somewhat similarly to her waistline. I kind of imagine a string inside cinching up the top from her back. I didn't do a super thorough research for the dress, but this felt like a reasonable design for a Mexican dress, so that's kind of just what I went with. And that's the final alcohol wash. The rest of the stuff is just me reworking the base slightly, and that's really it. So as usual, I'm gonna fade to the final reveal, and I will see you after that for the closeout. Here we are, once again. If you made it to the end of the video, thank you for watching, first of all. Very few people make it to the outro. I hope you found this video interesting. It's really out of my comfort zone to be talking about something this personal and this deep inside me in a very public way like this. Next video, I'll be back to my usual format, and this whole narration thing we won't do again for a while. Let me know what you think about it though. Maybe I'll do something like this again in the future. But yeah, that's it for now. Thanks so much again for watching, and I'll see you next time. Bye bye.